The small parish chapel of the village of Westmere had been built 93 years before the autumn morning on which Maelra Briarholt of the High Passes was scheduled to be married in it, and not one of the 72 villagers who came in through the heavy oak door of the chapel that morning had any idea who had paid for its building, because the small carved sandstone plaque above the lintel of the door, which had once said in plain letters who the donor of the chapel had been weather-worn to illegibility over the better part of a century, and the parish records that listed the donor by full name had been kept since the building of the chapel in the small bound parchment book of the parish, in the small back office of the chapel itself, which only the parish priest and his clerk ever opened, and which no living villager of Westmere had asked to see in living memory. The 72 villagers of Westmere who came into the chapel on the morning of the wedding had come, almost without exception, to enjoy themselves at the bride's expense. Word had reached the village 3 weeks before the wedding through the small marriage broker's office in the regional town of Eastlake that the bride who would be coming up the road into Westmere for the marriage of Alwyn Foxbridge of Foxbridge House at the top of the village was an Orc woman of the high passes north of the western counties, and the news had been received in the village in the way such news was usually received in the village, which was with the small, careful, slow circulation of an opinion organized initially by Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge, the groom's mother, that the marriage was beneath the dignity of the Foxbridge family of Westmere, and that the small public ceremony of the wedding ought, in the considered opinion of the older women of the village, to be attended by everyone in Westmere who could reasonably claim a chapel seat, in order that the small public ceremony of the wedding would, by the simple weight of its attendance, register on the bride and on the groom and on the broker and on the regional clerk and on anyone who cared to take notes the considered opinion of the village on the matter of marriages between Foxbridge sons and Orc women, the considered opinion of the village, by the careful arrangement of Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge in the 3 weeks of preparation, was to be communicated by means of the small, ordinary social weapons of a small village wedding, by the placing of the older women in the front pews on the bride's side, by the absence of the customary white ribbons on the chapel benches, by the deliberate avoidance of the older traditional musicians for the small pre-ceremony hymn, by the wearing of black rather than the usual pale gray by all the cousins on the groom's side, by the small, careful private circulation between the cousins and their friends, of a small list of 7 cutting jokes that any of them might use on the bride at any of the small social moments of the morning, during which a cutting joke might land. Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge had not, in arranging these small ordinary social weapons, instructed anyone to be openly rude to the bride. She had only arranged the small ordinary social weather of the morning so that everything short of open rudeness would be in the air around the bride from the moment she stepped through the chapel door. She had been arranging the small, ordinary social weather of small village mornings in Westmere for 31 years, and she was, by the long-settled opinion of every cousin and every neighbor of the upper end of the village, very good at it. The 72 villagers of Westmere came into the chapel of Westmere at the 9th bell of the morning of the wedding, in the small, careful social order Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge had instructed them to. They sat in the small, careful pews. They did not, in their sitting, smile at one another. They did, in their sitting, look up the central aisle of the chapel at the small wooden door at the back, through which the bride and her party would, at the half past the bell, come in. The half past, the bell rang. The small wooden door of the chapel did not, at the half past, open. The villagers waited. They did not, in the waiting, exchange remarks. Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge, in the front pew on the groom's side in her best dark plum wool dress, with the small lace collar and the small jet brooch at the throat, did not, in the waiting, turn her head. She had been a woman of the upper end of Westmere for 61 years, and she had learned, long before her own wedding, that turning the head in the front pew of the chapel at a wedding was the kind of small public movement that a woman of her own particular standing did not, in any circumstances she could not afford, allow herself. At the quarter to the next bell, the small wooden door at the back of the chapel opened. Malra Briarholt of the High Passes came in. She came in alone. She had been told 2 days previously, in the small inn at the bottom of the village where the marriage broker had arranged her lodging, that the customary practice of Westmere was for the bride to walk up the central aisle of the chapel on the arm of the senior male relation of her own family who had accompanied her to the village. She had not, on hearing this, mentioned to the marriage broker's clerk that her own senior male relation, who was her brother Tornac of the High Passes, was not in any condition to walk her anywhere on any morning of the rest of his life, having been, by the events of her own previous autumn, taken into the custody of the Crown Court at Wexley for a small private matter that did not concern the marriage broker or his clerk. She had not, on hearing this, mentioned that no other senior male relation of her own family was, in the autumn of her 26th year, available for the walking. She had said only that she would come up the aisle alone. The marriage broker's clerk had not, in her hearing, objected. He had filed the unusualness of the arrangement away in his own small, careful mental ledger, and he had, on the morning of the wedding, ridden over the small ridge from the regional town of Eastlake to attend the ceremony in person, because he had decided, in the 3 weeks of preparation, that any wedding at which the Orc bride of the High Passes would be walking up the aisle alone was a wedding the broker's office ought, by professional courtesy, to be represented at, and he had decided to attend himself. He was in the back pew on the bride's side when she came in. He was the only person in the back pew on the bride's side. He was, indeed, the only person on the bride's side of the chapel at all, because Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge had, in arranging the seating, instructed the small chapel clerk that the bride's side ought, by the small social meanness of the morning, to be left almost wholly empty in order to make the small public point of the bride's lack of family. He had been instructed, the chapel clerk, to seat only the broker's clerk in the back pew. He had done so. The bride's side was, when Melra came in, a long, quiet stretch of empty pews, 93 years old and beautifully kept, with a single small thin clerk of the regional broker's office sitting at the back of them, with his hat held in his hands across his lap. Maelra paused at the chapel door for perhaps a count of 3. She had been told by the small innkeeper's wife the previous evening, over a small cup of warm honeyed milk, what to expect. The innkeeper's wife, a small, kind older woman called Mrs. Greta Penwarren, who had been at the inn for 41 years, and who had, in those 41 years, served small cups of warm honeyed milk to a great many brides of a great many marriages of Westmere, had been the first person of the village to come up to Maelra without being told to by anyone, and had sat down across from her at the small inn table the night before the wedding, and had said very quietly, "Lady, I have known Hortense Foxbridge since she was 4 years of age. I have served her at this table for 41 years. I will tell you, before tomorrow morning, what she has arranged. I will tell you because I do not in the matter agree with her, and because nobody else in the village will, by tomorrow morning, have the basic personal courage to tell you. I am, on my own account, going to tell you now. I am also, on my own account, going to be at the back of the chapel tomorrow morning in the pew opposite the broker's clerk. I will not, by my sitting there, be able to undo what Hortense has arranged. I will, by my sitting there, refuse to be one of the 72 of her arrangement. I am, on the matter, sorry I cannot do more. Now eat your bread, lady. The morning is going to be longer than you think." She had eaten her bread. She had drunk the honeyed milk. She had thanked Mrs. Greta Penwarren of the inn. She had not, in the thanking, allowed herself any small reaction beyond the thanking, because she had decided that she would do her reacting, if any reacting was to be done, in the chapel itself on the morning, and not in the small inn parlor of a kind innkeeper's wife, who had taken the small private risk of coming to sit at her table the night before. She paused now at the chapel door, and she took the small private measure of the room. She saw the 72 villagers in their careful social order. She saw the empty bride's side. She saw the broker's clerk at the back on the right and Mrs. Greta Penwarren of the inn at the back on the left, sitting opposite each other in the two back pews. And she saw, between them, the long, quiet stretch of 93-year-old polished oak benches on the bride's side that had been left empty by Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge's design. She saw Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge in the front pew on the groom's side. She saw the groom himself, Alwyn Foxbridge, standing at the altar in a dark wool suit of the western counties, cut with the small white cravat the groom's family had insisted on, looking in his careful set face like a man who had been told the previous evening by his own mother in the small front parlor of his own house exactly how the morning was going to go, and who had been told by his own mother that any small public attempt on his part to alter the going of the morning would be remembered against him for the rest of his own life, and who had decided, in the small, careful set of his shoulders, that he was not on the morning going to alter the going. She saw, behind him at the altar, the parish priest of Westmere, who was a small, thin, older man called Father Brennan, who was 67 years old, who had been the parish priest of Westmere for 28 of those years, who was not by any small twitch of his face Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge's man, and who was, in the moment, in the small particular careful set of his thin face above his white surplice, looking at Maelra at the chapel door with the small careful set of a parish priest of long standing who had, in his careful clerical preparation for the morning the previous evening, in the small back office of his own chapel, by the small accidental reading of an old parish entry, he had not had any small particular reason to look up for 28 years, learned a small unexpected piece of the parish's own history that he had not, in his 28 years, previously known, and who had decided, in the small, careful set of his own personal moral economy, of a small western county's parish priest, that he was not, on this particular wedding morning, going to allow Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge of the front pew on the groom's side to have, by her own small, careful arrangement, the morning she had arranged. He had decided, the previous evening, what he was going to do. He had not, by any small twitch of his thin face, told anyone, including his own clerk, what it was. He had only set out, on the small reading stand at the back of the altar, the small bound parchment book of the parish, with a thin leather marker laid across one particular page near the front of the book that he had marked the previous evening at the moment of his unexpected reading. And he had decided that he would, at the appropriate moment of the small public ceremony, take the small marker out and would, at the appropriate moment of the small public ceremony, read aloud what the marked page said. He was, in his careful clerical set, ready. Maelra began the walk up the central aisle. She walked at her own pace. She walked alone. She walked in her dark mossy green linen wedding dress with the small braided leather cord at the waist and the small bronze pendant on the leather cord at her throat that she had worn every day of her 26 years and had not, for the wedding, taken off. She walked with her long, jet black hair loose down her back, the way the women of her own people walked up the small chapel aisles of their own clan house weddings, because she had decided, in the small private corner of her own self in the small inn parlor the previous evening, after Mrs. Greta Penwarren had gone back to the kitchen, that if Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge had arranged the small public weather of the morning to be the small ugly weather of the older women of the village, then she, Maelra, would do the small public walking of the aisle in the small private way of the older women of her own people, and she would do it without apology, and she would do it without alteration, and she would do it as the senior surviving heir of her own clan, in her own bridal dress, in her own bridal hair, in her own bridal posture, with her own bridal pendant at her throat, she walked. The 72 villagers of Westmere, in the careful social order of Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge's arrangement, watched her come. The first cutting joke came at the 11th pew from the back, on the groom's side, from a cousin of the groom called Laren, in a stage whisper meant to carry to the bride at exactly the pace at which she was walking. It was the smallest of the 7 jokes on the small private list. The bride did not, in passing, turn her head. The second cutting joke came from the 9th pew, the third from the 7th. The bride passed the third without turning her head either. The fourth came from the front pew at the moment she reached the altar. It came from Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge herself, in a voice not quite a whisper, which carried very plainly to the altar, and to the back of the chapel, and to the broker's clerk in the back pew, and to Mrs. Greta Penwarren of the inn in the pew opposite him. The fourth joke was not one of the small private list. It was a small remark that Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge had been saving for the morning. It was the meanest remark made aloud in any chapel in the western counties that decade. Maelra reached the altar. She did not turn her head at any of the 4. She stood at the altar at the groom's right hand, in her dark, mossy green wedding dress, with her long, jet-black hair loose down her back, and the small bronze pendant on the leather cord at her throat, and her amber eyes on Father Brennan of the parish of Westmere, and she did not, in the standing, allow any small movement of her face that any of the 72 villagers in their careful social order would later be able to use against her. Father Brennan looked at her. He had, the previous evening in the small back office, read the parish's records of every Foxbridge wedding for the last 120 years. He had done this in preparation for the wedding because that was the kind of preparation a parish priest of long standing did before a wedding of a senior local family. He had not, in the reading, expected to learn anything he did not already know. He had, at the small reading stand by his small office lamp, in the careful, slow reading of every entry from the autumn of the 90th year before the wedding morning, learned exactly one thing he had not known. He had learned it from the very first entry of the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere. The very first entry of the small bound parchment book was the entry of the building of the chapel itself, in the autumn of 93 years before the wedding morning, and the very first entry recorded the full formal name and lineage and clan of the donor of the chapel, who had been a woman of the high passes, who had married down out of her own clan house at the age of 22, and had come to the western counties and had bought, with the dowry her father had pressed into her own hands at her own clan house gate the morning she had ridden out, the long, quiet stretch of empty pasture south of the small ridge of the high passes that was now the village of Westmere, and had built on that pasture, at her own private expense and at the time of her own marriage, the small parish chapel of Westmere as her own bridal gift to the place she was, by her marriage, settling in for the rest of her natural life. The full formal name and lineage and clan of the donor were written out in the small, careful clerical hand of the parish priest of the parish of Westmere of 93 years before the wedding morning, and the entry had been signed and sealed by that previous priest's own small seal ring of the parish, and the entry was, on the morning Father Brennan had read it, the small, unfaded, careful clerical writing of the very first day of the small village of Westmere itself. The full formal name and lineage and clan of the donor of the chapel had been the full formal name and lineage and clan of Lady Alwyn of the clan Briarholt of the High Passes, senior daughter of the senior line of the clan head of Briarholt, who had married, in the autumn of 93 years before the wedding morning, a quiet local farmer of the South Ridge whose name had been recorded in the entry only as Edric of the South Ridge, in the small, careful way of the first parish recording of a man who had not, at the time of his marriage to the senior daughter of the senior line of the clan head of Briarholt, had any small social rank of his own to be recorded by. Edric of the South Ridge was the great-grandfather of Alwyn Foxbridge of Foxbridge House at the top of the village. Lady Alwyn of the clan Briarholt of the High Passes was, by direct descent, the great-grandmother of the bride who was standing at the altar of her own chapel, in her own bridal dress, in her own bridal posture, on the morning of the wedding of her own great-grandson by marriage. Alwyn Foxbridge of Foxbridge House and Maelra Briarholt of the High Passes were, by the small, precise reading of the parish entry, distant cousins of the same Briarholt Foxbridge family of Westmere, separated by 3 generations of intermarriage. The village of Westmere itself had been built on the dowry land of the bride's own clan house ancestor. The chapel they were standing in was the bridal gift of the bride's own clan house ancestor to the village, the small, ordinary, social weather Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge had arranged for the morning was being arranged by a woman who was, by the same parish entry, a direct descendant of the same Lady Alwyn herself, in the small, ordinary collateral way of the Foxbridge line, and who was, by the small, precise reading, the great niece of the original donor of the chapel she was sitting in the front pew of. Father Brennan had, the previous evening, read the entry 3 times. He had closed the parchment book. He had sat at the small reading stand by the small office lamp for the better part of an hour. He had thought about what to do. He had decided. He had set out the small bound parchment book on the small reading stand at the back of the altar, with the thin leather marker laid across the entry. He had not, in the night between the reading and the morning of the wedding, told a single living person. He looked now at the bride at the altar in her own bridal dress, with her long jet-black hair down her back, and the small bronze pendant on the leather cord at her throat. He looked at the groom on the bride's left, in the dark wool suit of the western counties with the small white cravat his mother had insisted on. He looked last at Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge in the front pew on the groom's side, in her best dark plum wool dress with the small lace collar and the small jet brooch at the throat, and at the small, careful private set of her 61-year-old face with the small, still warm satisfaction of the forth-cutting joke not yet quite gone from the corner of her mouth. Father Brennan smiled, very small, at Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge. He did not, in the smile, allow her to read the smile. He turned. He walked in the small, careful clerical step of a parish priest of long standing to the small reading stand at the back of the altar. He picked up the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere. He carried it forward, in both his hands, to the front of the altar. He set it, very carefully, on the small open prayer stand at the front of the altar, at which the marriage vows would be read. He opened the parchment book at the thin leather marker. He looked down at the page. He looked up at the 72 villagers of Westmere in their careful social order. He cleared his throat. He said, in the clear, unhurried reading voice of a parish priest of 28 years standing, "Before the vows of this morning's marriage are taken, the parish priest of Westmere will read aloud, from the first page of the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere, the entry of the building of this chapel, and the recording of the original donor of the chapel, in the autumn of 93 years before this wedding morning. The entry will be read in full in the small, careful clerical hand of the parish priest of the parish of Westmere of the autumn of 93 years before this wedding morning, with all small, careful clerical particulars of name and lineage and clan and dowry and parish recording preserved exactly as the small, careful clerical hand recorded them on that autumn morning. The reading will take perhaps 4 minutes. I ask the village to be still for the reading. I ask the bride to be still for the reading. I ask the groom to be still for the reading. I ask the front pew on the groom's side, in particular, to be still for the reading. I will, after the reading, proceed with the vows." He looked once, very briefly, at Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge. He did not, in the looking, allow her to read his face either. He looked down at the page. He began to read. He read in the slow, careful clerical reading voice in which the long, careful old parish entries of the western counties had been written and were meant to be read. He read every full formal title, every middle name, every clan recording, every dowry valuation, every small careful clerical particular. He did not skip. He did not summarize. He read the first entry of the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere, of the autumn of 93 years before the morning, exactly as it had been written down in that autumn 93 years before. In the small, careful clerical hand of the parish priest of Westmere of that autumn, he read the full formal name and lineage and clan of the donor. He read the donor's father's name. He read the donor's mother's name. He read the donor's father's mother's name. He read the donor's clan's full formal description as the Clan Briarholt of the High Passes, by clan line and by crown covenant, holders of the 3 valleys and the 4 villages, and the silver mines of Ironvine, by the small ancient covenant of the crown, with the small founding clans of the High Passes. He read the dowry valuation, which was a sum of money that, by the small, careful, slow inflation of 93 years, would now have been the value of a small grand estate. He read the description of the land bought by the dowry. He read the small, careful clerical sentence that described the building of the chapel itself as the small bridal gift of the donor to the small village she was, by her marriage, settling in. He read the name of the man the donor had married, who was, by the entry, Edric of the South Ridge, a quiet local farmer of the South Ridge of the Western Counties, who has not, before this marriage, had any small social rank by which to be recorded by, but who has, by this marriage, been received into the small newly founded family of Briarholt Foxbridge of Westmere as the husband of the senior daughter of the senior line of the clan head of Briarholt. He read the small, careful sealing paragraph of the parish priest of Westmere of that autumn. He read the small, careful additional sentence the previous priest had written underneath the seal, which had been, in the careful, slow clerical hand, "May the small village of Westmere, 93 years from this autumn, remember in its chapel pews the name of the woman whose bridal gift built this chapel on the land of her own dowry, and may the small village of Westmere, 93 years from this autumn, on the wedding morning of any direct descendant of Lady Alwyn, of the clan Briarholt, receive that descendant in the small ordinary kindness of a village descended by every roof of its main street from her own original gift." He stopped reading. He looked up. The 72 villagers of Westmere did not, for a quarter of a minute, breathe. Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge in the front pew on the groom's side had gone, in the slow, careful drain of a woman who had just been read aloud the precise, small, clerical paragraph that recorded her own great-aunt's bridal gift to her own village in her own chapel, by her own clerical priest, the color of fresh chalk. Her right hand had gone, without her noticing, to the small jet brooch at her throat. Her left hand was holding the front of the front pew, with the small, careful grip of a woman who was, in the moment, attempting to remember whether she had, in any of the last 3 weeks of the careful arrangement of the small, ordinary social weather of the morning, raised her voice loud enough at any point that it could be argued, in retrospect, that she had not in fact intended any of the small, careful arrangements at all. She had not, in her own careful recollection of the last 3 weeks, raised her voice at any point. She had only arranged. She had only arranged in writing, in private, with the chapel clerk, with the cousins, with the seamstresses, with the small kitchen staff of Foxbridge House. The arranging was, by every small, slow, careful inventory of her own face in the front pew, going to be remembered. Alwyn Foxbridge at the altar in his dark wool suit had not, during the 4 minutes of the reading, taken his eyes off Father Brennan. He had not, in the 4 minutes, breathed more than was necessary. He had, in the 4 minutes, allowed the small, careful set of his own shoulders, which had been carrying the mourning his mother had arranged for him to carry, to come down by a small, precise quarter inch. He turned his head at the end of the reading very slowly, and he looked at the bride at his right hand. The bride at his right hand was not, in any small visible way, surprised by any part of the reading. She had known, in her own private clan house ledger from the time she had been 12 years old, who her great-grandmother had been, and what her great-grandmother had done with the small bridal dowry she had been pressed into her own hands by her own father on the autumn morning she had ridden out of her own clan gate 93 years ago. She had known, when the marriage broker's letter had come to her own clan house, describing the small marriage being proposed by the Foxbridge family of Westmere of the Western Counties, precisely which Foxbridge family of Westmere of the Western Counties they were. She had known, in agreeing to the marriage, that she was agreeing to a marriage with a direct collateral descendant of her own great-grandmother. She had decided, in agreeing, that she would not, by any small advance announcement of the lineage, give Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge the small private opportunity to call off the marriage at the small clerical office of the broker. She had decided that she would, by agreeing without announcement, allow the parish priest of Westmere, on the morning of the wedding, to discover the lineage by his own clerical preparation in his own back office, and to do, on the morning, whatever the parish priest of Westmere, by the small private moral economy of a parish priest of long standing, would decide to do with the discovery. She had, in agreeing, gambled the small ordinary social weather of the morning on the small ordinary moral economy of one parish priest, of one small village of the western counties she had never met. She had been right about the priest. Father Brennan, by his own careful preparation and by his own small private decision the previous evening, had decided exactly as she had hoped he would. Mail returned to Father Brennan. She did not, in turning, smile. She inclined her head, very small, in the small formal acknowledgment of a senior heir of a high passes clan house to a parish priest who had read aloud the small, careful clerical sentence of her own great-grandmother's bridal gift in her own great-grandmother's chapel on her own great-grandmother's wedding anniversary land. Father Brennan inclined his thin 67-year-old head back to her, in the small formal answering nod of a parish priest who had been waited on by his own small private moral economy for 93 years to be allowed to read the careful clerical sentence aloud, and had been allowed, on this particular autumn morning, finally to do it. He closed the parchment book. He set the small thin leather marker carefully aside. He picked up the small clerical book of the wedding vows. He said, in the same clear, unhurried reading voice, "We will now proceed with the vows. The vows will be exchanged in the small, ordinary form of the Western counties. The bride and the groom will, after the vows, sign the parish register at the small side table by the altar. The signatures of the bride and the groom will be witnessed by two witnesses of the parish. The first witness will be Mrs. Greta Penwarren of the small inn at the bottom of the village, who has, by her own request to me last evening, agreed to stand for the bride. The second witness will be the broker's clerk at the back, who has, by his attendance from Eastlake this morning, made himself available for the standing for the groom. The marriage will then be entered into the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere, in the small, careful clerical hand of the parish priest of Westmere of this autumn morning, with all small, careful clerical particulars of name and lineage and clan and parish recording, preserved exactly as the small, careful clerical hand will record them today. The entry will, in the long, quiet life of this chapel, be the second entry of the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere to record the full formal name and lineage and clan of a senior daughter of the senior line of the clan head of Briarholt of the High Passes. It will not be the last. He turned to Alwyn Foxbridge. Alwyn Foxbridge of Foxbridge House. Will you take this woman, who is Maelra of the senior surviving line of the clan head of the clan, Briarholt of the High Passes, holder of the seal ring of Briarholt, sovereign by crown covenant of the 3 valleys and the 4 villages and the silver mines of Ironvine, great-granddaughter of Lady Alwyn of the same clan, Briarholt of the High Passes, founder of this village and donor of this chapel, as your lawful wedded wife, by the small ordinary form of the western counties, under the small clerical witness of the parish of Westmere, until the parting of your natural lives. Speak the answer. Alwyn Foxbridge took a breath. He said in a voice that was, for the first time in the morning, his own and not his mother's, I will. Maelra of the clan Briarholt of the High Passes, will you take this man, who is Alwyn Foxbridge of Foxbridge House of Westmere of the Western Counties, direct collateral descendant of Edric of the South Ridge and of Lady Alwyn of the clan, Briarholt of the High Passes, of the small newly founded family of Briarholt Foxbridge of Westmere, as your lawful wedded husband, by the small ordinary form of the High Passes, under the small clerical witness of the parish of Westmere, until the parting of your natural lives. Speak the answer. I will. Then by the small clerical authority of the parish of Westmere, and by the small clan covenant of Briarholt, and by the small crown covenant of the western counties, I, Father Brennan of the parish of Westmere, of 28 years standing, declare you, Alwyn and Melra, husband and wife. The 72 villagers of Westmere here gathered will, by the small chapel custom, rise to acknowledge the marriage. The 72 villagers of Westmere, in their careful social order, rose to acknowledge the marriage. They rose slowly. Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge in the front pew on the groom's side rose last. She rose with the small, careful grip of her left hand on the front pew the whole way up. She did not, in rising, look at the bride. She did not, in rising, look at her son. She looked, in rising, at the small carved sandstone plaque above the lintel of the chapel door, which had been weather-worn to illegibility over the better part of a century, and which she had, by every small, careful, slow circulation of an opinion of the upper end of Westmere, been told all her life had originally borne the small carved name of some old benefactor of the village whose family had long since died out. The small old benefactor of the village whose family had long since died out had not died out at all. The small old benefactor had been her own great-aunt. The small old benefactor's family was, by direct descent, sitting on the bride's right hand at the altar of the small old benefactor's own chapel in the small old benefactor's own village. Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge stood, with the rest of the 72, in acknowledgment of the marriage. She did not, in the standing, manage to make herself smile. She did not, in the standing, manage to make herself unclasp her left hand from the front of the front pew. She would, by the careful, slow, private inventory of her own face in her own bedroom mirror in Foxbridge House at midnight, That same evening, after the wedding feast at the inn at the bottom of the village had ended, and after she had walked back up the village in the small, careful, slow steps of a woman whose careful, slow, social arrangement of an entire month had just been read aloud out from under her in 4 minutes of careful clerical voice, decide that she would, for the rest of her natural life, never again attempt the small, careful, slow social arrangement of the small, ordinary social weather of any chapel morning of the village of Westmere. Of the, she would, by the same careful, slow, private inventory, decide that the new lady of Foxbridge House, who was now the bride at her son's right hand, would be, from the morning of the marriage, the actual woman of the upper end of the village, and that she, Hortense, would be the woman of the front pew, who had once attempted, in a careful, slow social arrangement of a single morning, to do the wrong thing in her own chapel, and who would, by every roof of every house on the main street of Westmere, from the morning of the marriage onward, be allowed only the small, ordinary social weather of a careful, slow, private retirement. She did not, in her own careful, slow, private retirement, attempt any further arrangement of any further chapel morning. She lived for the next 21 years in Foxbridge House. She did not, in those 21 years, speak Melra's name aloud at any meal, at any table, of the upper end of the village. She did not, in those 21 years, have to. The village spoke it for her. The 72 villagers, in their careful social order, of the morning of the wedding had been, for the 4 minutes of the careful clerical reading, the audience of the small, careful, slow rearrangement of the small, ordinary social weather of an entire village by one parish priest of 28 years standing on behalf of one bride of one High Passes clan house and one quiet local groom of the upper end of Westmere. The 72 villagers had, by the time they walked out of the chapel at the end of the morning into the small autumn sun of the village, decided privately and individually what they thought of the small, careful, slow arrangement of the previous 3 weeks. They had decided. Mrs. Hortense Foxbridge had not, in any of those 21 years, ever quite recovered the small, ordinary social weight she had been carrying in the front pew at the 9th bell of the morning of the wedding. She did not need to. The new lady of Foxbridge House was, by the small, ordinary moral economy of the small village of Westmere, the lady the village had been waiting 93 years to receive. Maelra and Alwyn signed the parish register at the small side table by the altar. In the small private days between the wedding morning and the 8th day, the village reorganized itself. Mrs. Greta Penwarren of the small inn at the bottom of the village was, by the small private decision of the 70 of the remaining 72 villagers, treated for the 7 days with the small, careful, slow, public respect of a woman who had, by her single, small, private courage of going to sit at a bride's table the night before a difficult wedding morning, made the difference of the morning. Mrs. Greta Penwarren did not on the matter accept the small, careful, slow public respect any more visibly than she had ever accepted any small public respect in her 41 years at the inn. She only continued in the small, ordinary mornings of her own kitchen to make the small, ordinary breakfast of her own inn and to set the small, ordinary cup of warm, honeyed milk on the small, ordinary inn table at the small, ordinary evening hour for any small, ordinary traveler who happened, in the small, ordinary slow turning of the western county's roads, to come up the South Ridge into Westmere, and to sit down at the table. She did, however, in the small, slow, private corner of her own kitchen on the morning of the third day after the wedding, allow herself 1 full minute of weeping into her own pinafore, very quietly, while she kneaded the morning bread, in the small, ordinary way that a kind older innkeeper's wife of 41 years standing wept on the morning after a difficult morning had, by the careful, slow work of one parish priest, and her own small courage of going to sit at a bride's table, become, by the 7 days following, the morning of the small, slow, careful kindness of an entire village. She was not, by the second minute, going to weep about it again. She had no further need to. Alwyn Foxbridge of Foxbridge House, on the evening of the wedding day, sat with his bride in the small front parlor of his own house at the top of the village, by the small banked fire of his own hearth, in the small particular quiet of a house from which his mother had not yet quite but very nearly retired. He held a small cup of dark spiced wine in his hands. He looked at his wife across the small low oak table between them. He said in the same voice that had been, for the first time in the morning, his own and not his mother's, Melra, I have, in the 3 weeks of the preparation, not asked you the only question I should have asked you. I am ashamed of the not asking. I am going to ask it now. Will you, by your own free choice, stay in this house with me? I am asking because I would prefer that the marriage we have, by the parish priest's reading this morning, been made into the marriage we have, in fact, been made into, be the marriage you have, by your own free choice, agreed to be in. I am not asking because I doubt. I am asking because I would prefer to know. She set down her own small cup of dark spiced wine. She looked at him across the small, low oak table for a long, quiet minute. She said, Alwyn, I will, by my own free choice, stay. I am, in agreeing to the marriage broker's letter, the woman who chose this morning. I am, in standing at the altar of my own great-grandmother's chapel, in my own bridal dress, the woman who chose this morning. I am, in sitting at this table with this small cup of spiced wine, the woman who chose this morning. I will be, by the small, slow, careful turning of every morning of the rest of our natural lives, the woman who chose this morning. Drink your wine, Alwyn. The morning is over. The evening is ours. He drank his wine. The morning was over. The evening was theirs. The bride's signature was witnessed by Mrs. Greta Penwarren of the small inn at the bottom of the village. The groom's signature was witnessed by the broker's clerk from Eastlake. The two witnesses signed in turn. Father Brennan added his own small, careful clerical hand and his own small parish seal ring. The entry was complete. He closed the parchment book. He set it carefully on the small reading stand at the back of the altar, where it would, by the small, slow, careful tradition of the parish of Westmere, be left open at the entry of the day's marriage for the 7 days following the wedding morning, so that any villager who wished to come into the chapel during the small quiet hours of the next 7 days and to read the entry on his or her own time could do so. He did, in setting it down, leave the small thin leather marker carefully laid across the page of the entry, with the first page of the parchment book also marked, with a second thin leather marker that he produced from his own clerical sleeve, so that anyone who came to read the marriage entry of the morning could also, by the simple turning back to the first marker, read the entry of the building of the chapel itself, and could decide, by the simple side by side of the two markers, what the morning had been. In the 7 days that followed, almost every one of the 72 villagers of Westmere came into the small chapel at some quiet hour of some quiet morning or some quiet afternoon, and read both entries side by side and walked back out into the small village. Some of them stayed in the chapel longer than others. Some of them read both entries more than once. Some of them, by their own small private inventory, wept quietly in the back pews while they read. The chapel clerk, who came in every evening of the 7 days at the last bell, to dust the altar and to trim the candles, noticed in his own careful clerical way which of the 72 had come in and on which day, and for how long. He kept the inventory in his own small clerical notebook. He did not, by his own small clerical custom, share it with anyone. He did, by the end of the seventh evening, allow himself, in the small private corner of his own clerical chair at the back of the altar, to nod once, very small, in his own private acknowledgement of the small private moral economy of his own village, which had, by the small, slow, careful private decision of 72 villagers in their own 7 days of 7 quiet hours, decided, all of them and all together, and without consultation, what kind of village Westmere was, and what kind of lady the new lady of Foxbridge House was, and what kind of small, ordinary social weather the 72 of them would, from the 8th day onward, be making for her at every small, ordinary social occasion of the village for the rest of their natural lives. They had decided. They did not, in the next many years, need to decide again. Alwyn and Maelra lived at Foxbridge House at the top of the village for the rest of their natural lives. They had 3 small children, 2 girls and a boy, all of whom were, by the small private decision of the High Passes clan house, raised under both the small, careful clerical custom of the parish of Westmere and the small, careful clan custom of the High Passes, and all of whom learned by the age of 7 to read the small, careful clerical hand of the parish register, and to read the first entry of the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere of the autumn of 93 years before their own parents' wedding morning, and to read the second entry of the same parchment book of their own parents' wedding morning, and to recognize in the small, careful, slow, side by side of the 2 markers, the small private moral economy of the small village they had been born into. The 2 girls married, in time, into the small local families of the western counties. The boy, who was named Edric, after his own great-great-grandfather, inherited Foxbridge House. He continued the small, careful, slow custom of the parish register of Westmere by leaving the marker on the entry of his own wedding morning for the 7 days that followed. The marker was, by the small, slow, careful tradition of the parish of Westmere, left on every wedding entry of every direct descendant of Lady Alwyn, of the clan Briarholt of the High Passes, for the 7 days following the wedding, for the rest of the natural life of the small parish of Westmere of the Western Counties. In the autumn following the wedding, on the small, ordinary anniversary of the wedding morning, Father Brennan walked up the small village street at the 7th bell with the small bound parchment book of the parish under his arm, and he came to the front door of Foxbridge House, and he knocked once, very quietly. Maelra opened the door. He held out the small bound parchment book. He said, "Lady, I would like, on the small ordinary morning of the anniversary of the wedding, to leave the small bound parchment book of the parish on the small mantel shelf of your front parlor for the day. I have copied the small, careful clerical sentence of your great grandmother's entry onto a small, clean square of fine vellum and pasted it into the back end paper of the parish copy that lives in the small back office of the chapel. The original small bound parchment book is yours for the day. You may, in your own small, careful, slow, private reading of it, read the small, careful clerical sentence of your own great grandmother's wedding morning at your own small, careful, slow, private leisure in the small, ordinary front parlor of the small, ordinary house your own great grandmother's small bridal dowry once built. I will come back for the parish book at the small, ordinary first bell of tomorrow morning. Will you accept the small, careful, slow, private leaving of the book? She accepted the small, careful, slow, private leaving of the book. She set the book on the small mantel shelf above the small banked fire of her own front parlor hearth. She read the small, careful clerical sentence of her own great grandmother's wedding entry twice in the small, careful, slow, private quiet of her own afternoon by the hearth. She closed the small bound parchment book. She set it back on the small mantel shelf. She did not, in the small, careful, slow, private quiet, weep, because she had not, in any morning of the small, careful, slow, private journey from her own clan house at the high passes to the small village of Westmere of the western counties, allowed herself to weep at any matter that had been, in the small, ordinary moral economy of her own life, the small private business of her own great-grandmother, and she was not, in the small, ordinary anniversary morning of her own wedding, going to start. She did by the small, careful, slow, private patience of one quiet hour in her own front parlor, by her own banked fire with her own great-grandmother's small, careful clerical sentence on the small mantel shelf above her, allow herself, finally, the small, careful, slow, private permission to be a woman of the small village of Westmere of the western counties, in her own small front parlor, in her own small, careful, slow afternoon, on the small, ordinary anniversary of her own wedding morning for the rest of her natural life. Father Brennan came for the parish book at the first bell of the next morning. She gave him the parish book at the door. He inclined his small, thin, 68-year-old head. He walked back down the small village street to the small back office of the chapel. The small bound parchment book was, by the second bell of that same morning, back on the small reading stand of the small back office of the chapel, where it would, by the small, careful, slow tradition of the parish of Westmere, remain for the rest of the small natural lifetime of the small bound parchment book of the small parish of Westmere of the western counties. Father Brennan continued as the parish priest of Westmere for 13 years after the morning of the wedding. He did not, in those 13 years, ever again read aloud, at any wedding, the small, careful clerical sentence of any small previous entry of the small bound parchment book of the parish. He did not need to. He had, by the small, careful clerical reading of one morning, set the small, careful private custom of 7 days of the parish register in motion, and the small, careful private custom did, by the 7th day of every subsequent wedding of the parish, the work the small, careful clerical reading had once needed to do. He died in the 82nd year of his life, in the small back office of the small chapel, with the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere open on the small reading stand beside him at the very first page, where it had been open every day for 13 years for any villager who cared to come in and read it. Maelra, Briar Holt, Foxbridge of Foxbridge House, at the top of the village of Westmere of the Western Counties, lived to the age of 79. She was buried by her own last small private request in the small graveyard at the side of the small parish chapel of Westmere, in the plot immediately to the right of the small mossy headstone of her own great-grandmother, Lady Alwyn, of the clan Briarholt of the High Passes, which had been weather-worn over the 93 years and the next 53, together to almost the same illegibility as the small carved sandstone plaque above the chapel door, but which had been, by the small, slow, careful annual labor of her own 3 children, and their children and their children's children over the next many generations, kept clean of the moss at the small, careful clerical hand of the original carving, so that any villager of Westmere who walked into the graveyard at the side of the chapel could, by the simple kneeling at the small foot of the small mossy headstone, read the full formal name and lineage and clan of the original founder of the village they were standing in, and could decide for themselves, in the small private corner of their own self, what the village they were standing in had been built on, and by whom, and for what reason. The reason had been by the small, careful clerical sentence of the parish priest of Westmere of 93 years before the wedding morning. The same reason the small, careful clerical hand had given for almost every clerical sentence of every entry in the small bound parchment book of the parish of Westmere. That a small village of the Western Counties, in the small, slow, ordinary life of its small, slow, ordinary streets was, in the long-settled opinion of the parish priest of that small village, mostly made of the small, careful, slow, private kindnesses of the women who had built it. Lady Alwyn of the clan, Briarholt of the High Passes, had built it on her own bridal dowry. Maelra of the clan, Briarholt of the High Passes, had been received into it by the small, careful, slow, private kindness of one parish priest of 28 years standing, one small, kind innkeeper's wife of 41 years standing, and 70 of the remaining 72 villagers in the careful, slow 7 days of their own quiet acknowledgement. The small village of Westmere of the Western Counties had been, by the long settled opinion of every parish priest of the small parish of Westmere, from the autumn of 93 years before the wedding morning to the small, slow autumn of the small, careful, slow ending of the small, ordinary world itself, exactly the small village it had been built to be. It is, in the long settled opinion of every villager, of every small Western Counties village, of every small Western Counties autumn since, exactly the small village every small Western Counties village ought to be. And by the small, careful, slow, honest reading of the small bound parchment book of the small parish of Westmere, by every visitor who has ever walked into the small parish chapel of Westmere, with the small markers still laid across the first page of the parchment book by the small last private request of the small late parish priest, Father Brennan of Westmere of 28 years standing, every small Western Counties village still is,